what I think is important here is not only is municipal policy important, but the story that I'm telling is trying to bring the politics back into municipal policy.
Right.
And precisely to say, this is not just a technical exercise. And in fact, all of the things that appear as technical exercises, that precisely those engineering dilemmas that I just described, those are downstream from political struggles and political relationships. And the main argument that I make in the book is that this seemingly depolitical or even anti-political concept of state capacity should be understood as a fundamentally political concept. That is, municipal states are produced through their relationships with social movements, particularly movements for housing.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. This is an episode about what some people have been known to call the global south. And it's about development and stagnation, about neoliberal disappointment, and the coming post-neoliberal multipolar future. Specifically, it's about Brazil and South Africa, but I think the US and China also come in and play their parts, prance up on the stage and then leave. As we go through this, you'll discover this. And it's also about cities, about urban power, and specifically about Johannesburg and São Paulo. One of those cities very close to me, the other one I've never been to, but I hope to hear more from our guests. I'm very happy to have my friend Ben Bradlow on the podcast. Ben is assistant professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton. And his first book just came out a few months ago called Urban Power, Democracy and Inequality in São Paulo and Johannesburg, which probably gives you a clue as to what we're going to be talking about. Hi, Ben.
Hello. Thank you for having me back on.
Back
I
on. Yeah.
have been on this podcast years ago.
Yeah, and yeah, like the hardcore can go and discover which episode that was and what number it was. I think it was maybe certainly double digits, not triple digits in terms of episode numbers, potentially even first single digits, but we'll see. Anyway, but we are going to be talking about cities. So I thought as a way into this, because there's lots of really interesting comparative stuff in your book about Johannesburg and São Paulo, but to kind of treat this in a broader sense, in a way that people will be familiar with in terms of a narrative, I think it might be worth bringing up the idea of Planet of Slums to take the title of Mike Davis's quite famous book from the mid 2000s. There's a statistic, I think you cite several points throughout the book, that 1 in 7 people globally live in slums or informal urban settlements, which is a product of urbanization without industrialization. And you know this material far better than I do. So if I say something which you just think is flat out wrong, do interrupt. But beyond just informality in housing, there's other sorts of informality which are a recurrent kind of motif throughout the book, particularly in employment. So to start off, I'm actually not sure what the question is here, but I just wanted to kind of put that forward as a kind of global portrait of where we are and a vision of not just now, but seemingly the future, which is rather different perhaps to the image we had of an urban world.
Yeah. So the basic narrative about cities historically is that there are two key waves of urbanization. The first is basically the wave of urbanization associated with the Industrial Revolution. And that, I mean, notwithstanding the fact that actually, like, if you read Marx, there's a lot of documentation of what we would now call informal workers or unemployed people basically being thrown in jail and taken off of the streets. But eventually there's enough industrialization that this absorbs new labor that's pushed out of rural areas through enclosure laws. And slums eventually turn into more formal housing. And there's a kind of like virtuous linear narrative over approximately a century or so, where you get a largely formalized workforce that's largely urban, and cities produce all kinds of agglomeration effects that are seen as good. In the Basically in the second half of the 20th century and early 21st century, you see a different kind of urbanization, sometimes associated with industrialization, particularly in the cases that I'm looking at. In South Africa's kind of more Latin American in this respect than compared to many of its closer African comparators, where you have industrialization that produces some drive to the cities, but then that urbanization is not associated with the degree of formalized industrialization that you see in the Industrial Revolution. And these are kind of cases where you see what now gets called premature deindustrialization. And then in many cases, particularly in Africa, large parts of South Asia, you see waves of urbanization mainly driven by push factors from the unviability of rural areas that is not associated with industrialization at all. So you don't see this kind of linear process of urbanization. So that's kind of like the abstract story, the abstract historical account. And stop me if I'm kind of like going too far
No.
out of
Go,
bounds.
go ahead. I was going to just actually make a point about,
Yeah.
for people who aren't familiar with neither South Africa nor Brazil, to give a sense of how urbanized they are. I know that these figures aren't always easily kind of mappable onto one another kind of globally, right? Because what one country statistics agency counts as urban versus rural is different from another's. I know that like even Britain and America and the United States is pretty different.
Mm-hmm.
When kind of U.S. Americans talk about urban, or rather talk about rural, they're talking very often about things which are far more urban than would be the picture that I have in my mind. So anyway, these things aren't always comparable, but because I had looked this up for a piece that I recently wrote, Brazil is something like 86% urban, which is like Western European levels. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's not Belgium, which is the most urbanized, but it's kind of comparable to kind of Western European countries, and a lot more so than South Africa and China, both of which are in the kind of mid 60
Yeah.
percentile, I think, something like that. But anyway, these are still quite urban countries.
Yeah. And in South Africa, and actually China's urbanization, at least in part, resembles South Africa in at least one respect, which is that there's histories of very strong top-down limitations on urban migration. So in many ways, apartheid was about managing flows to the cities, and you had one of the key techniques of apartheid was the pass that Black people had to have in order to authorize living in an urban area, and that was severely restricted. In China, you have a hukou registration system, which, at least in that sense, is very much like the technique of the pass in apartheid. So these are cases where you have levels of industrialization and seemingly desire to move to cities that would produce a level of urbanization that would look quite Brazilian, but for these top-down techniques of limiting urban migration.
Right. No, that's very useful, and also maybe a useful bridge to talk about the kind of historical trajectory, because that might be useful also
Yeah.
in terms of situating ourselves before we kind of go more deeply into São Paulo, Johannesburg comparisons, and why cities matter and what urban power is.
Mm-hmm.
So both, I think, to the extent that one can kind of put them up next to each other. You're not the only scholar who kind of makes comparisons between South Africa and Brazil, because there's lots of kind of enticing elements. You're like, well, these are pretty different places and yet quite similar. Both have this history of authoritarian development and kind of throughout the Cold War, with strong exclusion, particularly in cities. Of course, South Africa has apartheid, which Brazil doesn't have, but that's one of the differences within a story which is kind of similar. Both are followed by this moment of democratic promise, the end of apartheid, national liberation. In Brazil, the end of the dictatorship, democratization, followed by or accompanied with a kind of neoliberal disappointment, which comes at sort of different sorts of phases. In Brazil, you have the Real plan, which is strongly like anti-inflationary. huge unemployment in the 90s and whatever. But then you have this moment of promise once the PT actually comes to power, having been an important force in democratization. And then you have probably most recently a kind of end of progressive hegemony. I can tell the story in Brazil much more easily than I can about South Africa. But you have the PT being kicked out of office, the parliamentary coup of 2016, the end of, I think, a certain progressive cultural hegemony in Brazil as well. And then in South Africa, which we've talked about on this podcast before, but it's the ANC's withering political hegemony and kind of the end of a whole process of kind of national liberation and the loss of kind of energy and direction and purpose to that whole project, it seems. I don't know if you agree with my characterization.
I totally agree. I mean, in many ways, the Brazilian center left hegemony has been a lot weaker than what we might think of a center left. I don't know exactly how you characterize ANC, but certainly in global terms, this is something that would be considered center left in terms of its ideological orientations in the contemporary moment. In Brazil, the PT has the PT has had a lot of hegemony at the national level, particularly in terms of presidential elections since 2002. But it's had a lot of mayoral administrations. Very few of the most urbanized states in the South and Southeast have had PT governments. For example, São Paulo state has never had a PT government. And in contrast, in South Africa, ANC until 2016, outside of Cape Town, had exercised pretty uniform rule across all of the major cities, all of the major provinces, and certainly at the national level. And it continues in a coalition as the leading coalition partner in a coalition government today at the national level. So I'm just trying to kind of like push towards the comparative dimensions here. In many ways, we might have expected the ANC government or governments, depending on which scale you're looking at in South Africa, to be positioned to be more effective than its analogous comparators in Brazil, particularly when you're looking subnationally. Also, the kind of like social and cultural hegemony is in many ways stronger in South Africa for the ANC, at least for many years coming out of the 1994 democratic transition. For all of the popularity of Lula at various points in the 2000s, there's probably no global political figure who has been more universally sanctified since the end of the Cold War than Nelson Mandela. And to challenge the right of a new Black majority government to implement reforms in South Africa would, for a long time, would have been basically unthinkable.
Yeah.
Whereas the PT, this is a class-based party. It's the ANC historically had elements of a class-based party. It was an alliance with the trade union federation COSATU and the Communist Party in South Africa. But it also had this African nationalist component. So in theory, this is an alliance that's combining race and class in a way that was not articulated in PT governments, notwithstanding the fact that, depending on how you measure it, Brazil is a majority non-white country. So all of these factors, in theory, might lead us to expect that South Africa would have turned out in a more progressive direction along many lines of analysis than Brazil. And in fact, observers in the 90s who were comparing these, because you're absolutely right that this is not, I'm certainly not the first person to make this comparison. I think this comparison has been made on your show and it's been made in academic literature for decades. Observers in the 90s who asked this question predicted largely that South Africa would turn out better than Brazil.
Okay. Right. Interesting. And what this means for cities, and specifically the cities that you analyze in terms of Johannesburg and São Paulo, um, you know, maybe this is a spoiler, but yeah. So but I think you've already
Spoiler.
hinted at, you already hinted at, São Paulo does certain things reasonably well, which Johannesburg has failed to do, despite the story you've just been telling in terms of, ANC's kind of total hegemony of the political field, social support, etc., just to a level that the PT never had, right? I just wanted to kind of retake up the historical narrative in terms of what it means for cities, right? Because this is something you
Yeah.
kind of do in your comparisons throughout the book, but just telling this kind of history of the passage from kind of authoritarian development. Is that a fair term to kind of characterize both Brazil and South Africa? So this history of authoritarian development through the Cold War, through democratization under neoliberal circumstances, global neoliberal circumstances, through to today. Like, what does that mean for cities? How did that process shape cities like São Paulo and Johannesburg?
Yeah. So when you're saying authoritarian development, I would just modify it slightly to say authoritarian developmentalism. That is, and that's implicitly in your contrast between neoliberal democratization. That is, in both instances, authoritarian politics are associated with strong state support for relatively closed economies, targeting import substituting industrialization, which produces a relatively thin but stable industrial middle class of sorts, and also produces a lot of so-called surplus uh, informal or semi-formal labor that's supporting this thin but protected industrial sector. And that's the basis of informal urbanization, that large the informal or semi-formal sector that's surplus but quite oriented towards this developmental industrialization during authoritarian periods in both countries. And so that what that means in the built environment is an explosion of slums in both Johannesburg and Sao Paulo. In Sao Paulo, this is more private sector driven, but supported implicitly through the state. In South Africa, it's more explicitly through the state. You see large waves of evictions that push people from relatively central neighborhoods to expanding peripheries. You see the development of informal land markets in the peripheries of cities to house these new informal and semi-formal workers and their families. And once you get to democratization, you have an additional wave that's an additional wave of informalization that's being promoted by what you're rightly referring to as a relatively neoliberal economic model that at least coincides with democratization in both countries, opening up to global markets, less protection for industry that had developed in both countries on the backs of significant state support. And that's reflected in the built environment, where there's a persistence of informal growth that is largely driving urban growth.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, hearing you say that the extent to which this is somewhat independent from politics, right? It's somewhat independent from kind of regulatory forms and the kind of intentions of governors and whatever, that this kind of, that this informalization is something which, I mean, it's an economic kind of process of development, which happens sometimes despite political intentions, or kind of democratization, which would you think would put an end to, that's putting it too strongly, but kind of would act as a break in some way to kind of informalization. So anyway, but despite all this, you end up kind of also trying to tell a story that runs counter to, I think, probably a lot of response in the global north to the planet of slums idea, which is like, well, that's all that's all fucked, isn't it? I mean, more or less, right? And actually, when you start looking at the details of it, at least within states with kind of some capacity,
Yeah.
nevertheless, still some capacity in Brazil and South Africa, that they're able to kind of do different things at a municipal level, which are able to improve the situation, and not just in a kind of limited ameliorative sense, but kind of in a kind of developmental process of some sort of, for example, going from 35% with indoor plumbing to 65%, to pick up a figure which I've half remembered from your book,
Yeah.
something like that.
25% to 65%.
Right. Wow, even bigger. Right. Okay. Well, maybe why don't you tell us about that then?
Um, so yeah, one kind of assumption. Actually, it's not. I don't know how deeply it is in Davis's argument about Planet of Slums, but certainly other observers of the relationship between neoliberalism and global urbanization. One assumption is that municipal government doesn't matter, and that it's all these large scale forces that are driving the story of what's happening in the built environment of cities. And my point is not to say that that is entirely wrong, but it is to say that, particularly in cases where there's meaningful, that there are reasons to expect some meaningful capacity at the urban scale for governance, that you might see some variation. And in fact, we do see some variation such that I think we need to that has significant theoretical implications for how we understand the role of city governments in shaping the urban built environment, even under these uh, significant structural conditions. So, and I think the most illustrative stat that I use in the book that is the one that you bring up, which is in both São Paulo and Johannesburg, you see informal settlement populations of between 10 and 15% throughout the period that I study in the book, which is late 80s, early 90s to 2016, which is a moment of significant political rupture in both countries. In Sao Paulo, the informal settlements in the first census taken after democratization, you have 25% of households with a flush toilet inside the house. And that almost triples to, I think, 66% or 64%. In Johannesburg, you actually have a higher share in the first census taken after democratization of households in an informal settlement with a toilet inside the dwelling. It's in the 30s. I think it's about 35%. And that rises only slightly to 47%. So that's quite a significant difference. And one thing there are few reasons why that stat helps illustrate configurations of governing power in the city, because sewage is extremely difficult to install into informal areas. You have unplanned settlements. There's not like clear roads that are straight. There's not been an engineer who's planned the siting of houses so that pipes underground can reach those dwellings. And land rights are not assigned in a formal way. So you have to figure out, how are you going to move the physical structures so that they'll be in a alignment to deliver pipes. You have to figure out, how are you going to deliver pipes in a way that the law is going to enable you to do that without fully assigning individual land rights. So you have to make sure that people feel that they're not going to be evicted, but they may not have the right to sell their property, for example. And that configuration of housing, sanitation, and land rights is something that Sao Paulo figured out to quite a significant degree in a way that Johannesburg never has. And this is one of the most difficult aspects of urban planning for informality anywhere in the world. So my contention in this book is that kind of example is illustrative of quite significant development of capacities to deliver in contexts where, precisely because of the observable planet of slums that Davis was writing about, the observable structural characteristics of global neoliberalization and the weakening of governance in the built environment as a structural condition globally. Despite all of that, you see this massive change that I contend is important to understand theoretically in terms of variation across cities, and not just saying that every city is a basket case, to use a less crude version of how
Right.
you
Yeah.
describe the planet
Right. No,
of
yeah, yeah.
some
But you can go
species.
like, oh, well, Jakarta, similar
Yeah,
sort of city, whatever. Oh, it's sinking. Like, oh, it's screwed, right? I mean,
yeah,
the
yeah,
whole
yeah,
city's
yeah, yeah.
sinking. It's gone, right? And so, I mean, that's interesting, and I mean, that certainly kind of runs counter to at least my bias against kind of municipal politics,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which is my, I mean, it's probably just a reflection of my kind of impatience with detail, because
No, but
there's a lot of policy and not that much politics when you come to kind of municipal level. Whereas when you're talking to the kind of level of the nation state, there's a lot more politics to kind of get your teeth into. And I want to then kind of maybe give you the opportunity to talk about the politics behind kind of the politics behind the municipal level of government, to put it that way. And maybe this is a way, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the kind of different theories that talk about cities in terms of like the neoliberal global city and the growth machine idea, or if you just want to talk about the specificities of what's going on in São Paulo or Johannesburg. I leave it to you.
no. Well, I think instead of getting too deep into all of the theory in an abstract way, I just want to push. I mean, in a way, I totally agree with you that the municipal level, there's good reason to not over valorize the municipal level. That in fact, I started this project wanting to look at labor markets,
Right.
and I realized that it wouldn't make a lot of sense to look at municipal politics and policy in order to find drivers of labor outcomes, because those are produced by more structural factors, largely at the national or even global scales. What I think is important here is not only is municipal policy important, but the story that I'm telling is trying to bring the politics back into municipal policy.
Right.
And precisely to say, this is not just a technical exercise. And in fact, all of the things that appear as technical exercises, that precisely those engineering dilemmas that I just described, those are downstream from political struggles and political relationships. And the main argument that I make in the book is that this seemingly depolitical or even anti-political concept of state capacity should be understood as a fundamentally political concept. That is, municipal states are produced through their relationships with social movements, particularly movements for housing. And in both, and one of the bases for comparison of these two cities is that in struggles for democratization, housing movements that were oriented around issues like rent, rights to housing, rights to basic services, right to transportation, these urban movements were critical to organizing struggles for democratization alongside trade union movements, and that these movements went in very different directions after democratization. And the reason that they went in different directions had to do with their relationship with municipal government. So in Sao Paulo, you have a PT, Workers' Party mayor that comes into power in 1989, winning in the 88 election. It's a candidate who was not supported by Lula's faction within the PT and was seen as a bottom-up challenge to Lula's more kind of syndicalist top-down rule within the PT. And this mayor named Luisa Erundina was very tied to housing movements. And she brought housing, she basically told all of her senior appointees that they had to bring movements into the government. In contrast, the ANC took a decision that, and this was kind of like a Leninist, vanguardist view of the party in the state, that movements should now stay out of the practices of the state. And that produced an orientation towards what was effectively a much more anti-political mode of administration. Perhaps ironically, that it's the more vanguardist approach that becomes more anti-political. And what I argue is that that left it vulnerable to more kind of hidden strategies of resistance from traditional elites in the city, whereas in Sao Paulo, you had a more durable set of movements that could push for programmatic policies over time that enabled precisely the kinds of outcomes that I've described. This is
Were
a
there more
more
channel-
political view of state capacity.
So were there more channels of representation, basically? Is that the argument, or is it?
Yeah, but it's not. Brazil globally is famous for things like participatory budgeting and participatory councils and all these kind of like formalized spaces of participation. This is not what's driving the story in Sao Paulo. It's about a mode of political intermediation that is just movements, parties, and bureaucrats, and movements are driving that link. It's not being pushed into formal and ultimately spaces that become depoliticized over time, which even in the most successful cases of participatory budgeting in Brazil, which is probably the most successful case of participatory budgeting in the world, there's a recognition that these are spaces that have become depoliticized over time and as a consequence less effective over time.
Right, interesting. So what is this? Is this what urban power is? I mean, this is the title of the book.
Yeah.
But it's a concept you kind of develop, and it kind of, I think the term conceals quite a lot of depth behind it. So maybe what is urban power?
Yeah. So this is capturing two ways, the capacity to configure two kinds of relationships in urban governance. And especially in a podcast like this, I'm like, I don't want to invoke governance too much because I know
because they'll shut off your mic. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know the anti-political connotations of governance, but what I'm trying to bring in the politics behind governance, and the problem is that this is a term that I think actually emerges from a political view of how statecraft works, and it's been turned into something that it is, as you would rightly critique, it's totally devoid of politics in its mainstream usage now. But what I'm trying to say is it's both the relationships between local government and movements and the way that those relationships produce internal capacities within the state. So, on the other hand, we can talk about politics all day, but there are distinct challenges of how do you coordinate the fundamentals within the state that require our attention. And what I'm arguing is it's precisely because those politics are present in Sao Paulo, because those movements are constantly developing those channels of communication and pressure with the local state, that they actually produce a greater capacity within the local state to coordinate the more technical side of statecraft. Whereas if you were to just focus on that technical side of statecraft and assume that these politics don't matter, my argument is particularly in these cases of middling state capacity, where you might expect eventually some capacities could be generated to deliver in informal settlements, you likely wouldn't actually deliver without that pressure from movements.
Right, right. No, that's good. And I like that. I mean, it pushes back both against the kind of technocratic vision and indeed academic governance mongers who depoliticize the matter, as well as people like me who might talk the big talk about development, but, doesn't really know how this open sewer gets turned into kind of closed sewer and what are the political forces behind it, which actually lead to, going from 25% having an indoor toilet to 65%, which is important because it actually needs to happen, not just talked about. So no, I think that's absolutely right and interesting. One of the ways that you discuss this, and as a certain co-host of this podcast might say, not me, I love
I don't
a good.
even know who you're
Well, I'm
you're
talking about I'm talking,
subtweeting right now.
but yeah, Bunga George,
Okay.
who loves a good table. Nevertheless, I think he might be right in certain instances. You have this plotted out in terms of embeddedness and cohesion, which might be kind of not the sexiest terms, but they but I mean, 'cause I don't know what I don't. I think on face value, it's not obvious what they refer to, but actually, they're a really kind of neat way of kind of conceptualizing politics at a kind of city level and who rules and who's in charge and who pushes whom in what direction, etc. So maybe talk us through that.
And well, actually, the way of thinking about these terms comes from a classic work on national development, which is Peter Evans's work on developmental states. His book called Embedded Autonomies, comparing South Korea, Brazil, India, and what was then, when he was writing, called Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo. And his point was focused on when he was talking about embeddedness, he was talking about the relationship between bureaucrats and not movements, but business elites. And these were largely what he really had in mind were the so-called chaebols in Korea, the big business conglomerates like Samsung that were able to develop channels of communication with bureaucratic elites so that they could be very precise in the kinds of carrots and sticks that they developed to drive export-oriented development in Korea. But what I'm arguing here is, he was talking about an authoritarian developmental regime. Korea is in many ways, until China, the classic authoritarian developmental regime. And I'm talking about democratic contexts where it's much more plural in terms of the kinds of actors that are trying to access government and have reason to expect to be able to access government. And so when I use embeddedness, I'm talking about the role of movements in orienting local government towards informal settlements. The truth is, local government in most of the world can ignore informal settlements.
Right.
This is not like the tax base of government. In many cases, local governments are not even generating a lot of local revenue. And so local governments are going to be oriented to those actors who can help. I mean, they're desperate for local revenue. So that's going to be property elites. And when I did research for this book, like in Sao Paulo, when I went to the municipal government building, I would see private developers walking out of the building when I was walking in, and I had interviewed them a week before.
Right.
So, like, this is not a situation where private developers are absent from the scene. So it takes a lot of social power generated from below to get local government to be oriented towards difficult tasks of delivering in informal settlements. And that's what embeddedness is about here. And then cohesion is trying to capture it's the coordination problems in local government are in many ways more difficult than what the autonomy was that people like Evans were describing as critical to national developmental states. When you're talking about autonomy for national development, you're usually talking about an economic ministry, which has very specific kinds of levers that it can exercise on its own as an agency. And in local government, to deliver in the built environment, you have to coordinate across many agencies within the city. You have to coordinate across scales of government for various funding streams and legal regimes. And so that's what cohesion is trying to capture.
Right. No, I think that's useful and kind of I like it's well illustrated by your example of kind of walking into municipal government and the developer kind of walking out. Did you come out with a briefcase full of money, or did you go in with one?
He didn't show me his briefcase.
No, but your what was in your briefcase?
There was nothing in my briefcase.
Sounds a likely story. Right. So
this is going out to the public. So
right. Yeah. Hello, friends. You've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.